for the night, and welcome Dr. Vanessa Ewing. Thank you so much for coming. So Dr. Ewing has been a principal, a counselor, and a teacher for gifted and talented and special education students over the last 20 years. She is the current co-chair for diverse populations for the Colorado Association for Gifted and Talented, and she has worked with Linda Silverman for the last several years. She will be talking tonight on It Is Okay to Not Be Gifted. And I'm just going to quickly read the description to give a little introduction to your talk, Dr. Ewing. For many families, being told a child does not qualify for gifted and talented services is a profoundly painful and confusing experience. This can bring up a wide range of emotions and feelings, including anger at the school and leadership, worries that there is something quote unquote wrong with their child, and concerns that a child will receive a subpar educational experience. Common scenarios will be shared during our time together. We will discuss the experiences of families, how to make plans for family support, and concrete strategies for supporting families through the process of potentially not ever qualifying for gifted and talented services. So Dr. Ewing, with that, I will turn it over to you. I will be keeping an eye on the chat, and we will have a question and answer time at the end. Sound good?
Sounds great.
All right.
All right. Thanks for having me. Let me go ahead and get my screen share started here. So yes, our talk today is, it's okay not to be gifted. Things that I'd like to cover today includes thinking about these labels and really the meanings that they hold for individuals and what type of impact they may have. We're going to also have a discussion of, did that for a minute. We're going to have a discussion of positive and negative experiences of both families and on the educator side. I'm both. I think many of you here are both as well. And then how to navigate a way forward. So these are a few experiences. I put a more positive one in here, but I know these are common experiences for families where someone can be quite blunt and uncaring, or it feels like they're uncaring, at least in the way that they present. They say, we tested, your kid's not gifted. And that feeling of being dismissed or being ignored and not having anything to do, I think, is not that uncommon. I've also I was thinking of a little girl that I worked with years ago, and, she was little and she had been talking with her parents about it. And she said, I'm not gifted like my sisters. I'm just average. I guess I can't go to the same school that they do. And so that was, profoundly painful. And that story did have a happy ending, but I know that they don't always. The way I try to coach teachers that I work with now in my role in Denver Public Schools is really, it's ongoing, right? So we can't say a student is or is not, but something to the effect of, at this time, we don't have enough evidence based on the state laws that we're researching, but we're going to continue to gather data and maybe making sure that the families know what data we can look for as well through a variety of resources, asking families about the concern. We're going to talk about this more in just a little bit, and then asking what types of resources or supports might be helpful. So what I'm really hoping for, right, is a collaborative relationship. I'd love to hear others' thoughts on this later, but thinking of the most common reasons why families want that gifted and talented label for their child, I think by far the most common reason is access to services that we believe are going to be beneficial to our children. Very understandable. I also think there's families where maybe everyone has been identified gifted for the last couple of generations, and so it can be a little bit jarring when it's a part of our own identities and our family's identities. That's another piece. And then we need to think about what giftedness means to us. So what types of traits and things may we associate with giftedness, and how we navigate that, or what that means to us and our children. One thing that is discussed a lot, because sometimes the label, the term gifted, is misunderstood, not only in our day-to-day lives, but also for a lot of educators who, most of which have not had any gifted courses or training. But to understand that every child has gifts, not every child is gifted. And we're referring to really the educational and legal term. And even that can vary a bit in terms of which states we're talking about. Every child has struggle areas, but not every child has a disability. And again, we're talking about the educational or legal terms. So unfortunately, I feel like far beyond that, we've had a lot of talk about these terms and misunderstandings of these terms. I think part of it also has to do with this concept of average, right? And how this makes us feel. So I think for many, when we think of the word average, we think, yeah, it's like everybody else, right? There's nothing really special or unique. It's just, hey, it's just the average second grader. And it doesn't feel very good because it's not really honoring and noticing and uplifting those unique individual traits and gifts, not gifted necessarily, right? But gifts that each child brings with them. And we want to make sure that they're being seen and heard and recognized. I got very excited about some of this research. His name's Todd Rose. He's got a YouTube TED Talk, and he also has a couple books out. I believe he's from Harvard, fascinating guy. But what he said is when we design school for the average learner, we're designing school for no one. Learning profiles are variable. We want that differentiation or a level of individualization within each class. This is fascinating research. He was looking at fighter pilots. And at the beginning, when they were trying to design these multi-million, maybe even billion-dollar aircraft, they designed it for the average person, thinking that that would work out pretty well. It did not. There were very few people that average profile or that average build worked for. And what they discovered by making it malleable to the person, right, for taller people, smaller people, and so on, they drastically improved their numbers of talented fighter pilots. So if we can create schools and systems, which is easier said than done, but design schools that remove barriers, that are what we call as educators, creating a universal design for learning, that it benefits everyone, and it benefits far more than just those individuals we might be thinking about, such as special or gifted education in this instance. Another example of this would be ramps that we use to put into buildings. Of course, that's going to create equity and an experience that works well for students in wheelchairs, for instance. But how many other individuals can benefit from those ramps? Let's say I'm hurt. Let's say the stairs are icy, or maybe I'm pushing a baby stroller, right? There's all these reasons why a ramp helps not only that original individual that we're often thought of, like individuals with wheelchairs, but so many more. When we think about some barriers that families face, one is certainly tied to state and district practices. So, you know, even the way we've defined gifted, it's not a static thing. It has changed over the years in Colorado. It has changed over the years elsewhere. And although we should all be following the same law in Colorado, we have something called portability now, meaning if we are following state law, those gifted labels should stay with us. That's not always what's happening. So there are definitely instances where a student leaves their district and goes to a new one and is told, hey, this isn't what we need to identify your learner as gifted. We can talk about potential strategies for how to navigate that, but that's not uncommon. We know that there's barriers in terms of there's biases within every test, or maybe the tests that are used, one test versus another. And by definition, we're typically looking at 3 to 5% of learners for some of those specific approved tests, such as some cognitive assessments. And last but not least, this might be one of the biggest ones. How many individuals, and I was one of those, suddenly one day my test phobias went away, but how many individuals struggle with tests, right? They panic, they have kind of anxiety and a lot of other things happening related to tests, and so they don't do well. Or there's other individuals that, because of their disabilities perhaps, or other things, they're not able to show what they know, or not very well. And so it becomes very, very difficult I've talked to so many schools where they're like, I know this child is clearly so gifted, but by gosh, they are not, they don't want to jump through the hoop, or they're not able to because of one reason or another, show what they know on a test. I think what often happens when a child is not identified as gifted, and we've been looking at it, we've been researching it, it's felt right, or it's at least felt like a strong possibility before, is that families are left wondering. Maybe that child's left wondering as well. Okay, I thought maybe it was this, maybe it's not. I know I'm not connecting with others, or this kind of average educational experience is not doing it for me. I know and feel different, but now I don't know why, right? There's questions like, why is my child struggling in school? If they're average, or if they're not identified gifted, shouldn't they be doing right? Shouldn't they be doing fine without needing some differentiation or some accommodations? Or why is my child still bored? Like, they know this stuff. Whether or not they're identified, they know this stuff. I like to say, and it's one of the things, again, that I share with many others, is kind of that if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, acts like a duck, it's probably a duck, right? So just because a child isn't labeled doesn't mean that they don't need those services or some type of different educational experience. When we look at some of these gifted traits, and I may be speaking a bit to the choir here, we've got some links that we'll share later, but there's a lot of traits that are shown for gifted learners that might really resonate for you. Are they super highly skilled? Maybe across areas or in some particular areas, right? So 2, 3, 5 years advanced. Do they ask lots of questions? They're highly curious. They just want to know, right? They're mentally and physically involved. This is where students may have a twice exceptionality, or oftentimes it's just a common gifted trait. Kids needing less rest, having more energy, seeming to always be on the go. Very similar to some disabilities that we might think of, but it can just be a gifted trait as well, which is why we need various experts to be coming to get together to make an accurate diagnosis. Really strong feelings and emotions. So happy, that's awesome. Angry, watch out. They might need less repetitions. They learn new things quickly. They like to start or initiate a lot of things. They can be perfectionistic, self-critical, intense. And then I think a really common one as well is being seen as a leader, or maybe being a leader. That doesn't necessarily always mean a positive leader. It depends on what those experiences are, how the child is doing overall. And especially when they're younger, preschool, kindergarten, so on, that piece of not necessarily honing the leadership skills yet, but having a real strong kind of dominant personality are there. There's lots and lots of pathways to identification. So one of the links I'm going to give you at the end, you can research more, or we can talk further later, but there's so many different assessments and tests and things we can do to look at identification. But we want to look at, maybe we continue down that path, maybe we don't. Going back to our earlier mention, I think the most important thing for families is wanting an educational experience that fits their child and their needs. So shopping for schools. There are lots and lots of choices. There are lots of magnet schools, charter schools, neighborhood schools, and so on to look for in Colorado. Colorado in particular, we have so many choices. Some districts more than others, but regardless, lots of choice. That can be a real gift, right? Because you don't have to stick at that one school, potentially. Do some tours, do some online research, jump into gifted and talented or advanced learner Facebook discussion groups, for instance, and ask other individuals about their recommendations or their experiences. A lot of times I've seen families get really hyper-focused within my district on wanting to get into a particular school that, again, you need that gifted identification for. But I know, and I know it's a case many places, we've got schools that aren't necessarily gifted and talented schools that are doing everything right. And they've got tons of advanced learners, they've got tons of gifted learners, and they're really differentiating for those learners, making sure they're getting access to high level instruction. regardless of that label. So if you have the opportunity, being able to do some research on your own and collaborating with others that, you know, might be family members, might be the gifted and talented leaders within your district, it's very, very helpful. And then sometimes choice can feel like a curse. I mentioned we've got so many options, maybe more than any other state that I know of, and that's extremely overwhelming. So getting connected to individuals that can help you navigate that is very helpful, very important. A blessing within the field of gifted and talented, I think, is that we're a really passionate bunch of people, and I think by and large love helping families navigate these things. Or potentially you don't have that opportunity, right? You're working all the time. You can't be driving your child across to a different area, or maybe there's multiple children. And so it's like, no, I have to stay put at my current school. So what can we do if we're staying in the same system? You're staying where you're at and it's not feeling great right now. This is not an exhaustive list, but certainly find your advocates. Hopefully there's someone that's in charge of gifted and talented at your school. There are other individuals that can talk, hopefully, to your need for something different. As a general rule, there's limits to this, of course, but I think being a little bit of a squeaky wheel without going overboard, schools can and districts can listen to families far more than they listen even to the teachers at times. So your voice does matter. So if you have the opportunity to get more involved at your school or get involved at the school district level, I think it's extremely helpful. Any way that you can advocate for your child to do pre-tests, let's say they're continuing to do the same math that they've known how to do forever. Figuring out if your child can demonstrate that they already know it, can we do or help create together something different? Or if they get done with their work very quickly and they want to dive into some other areas of interest, can we get that kind of built into their day? And I mentioned before, but talk to your district folks as well. They can be helpful. Think about what are some new things that they can learn, both academically and socially. We've got some real social needs for gifted learners as well, and that might be a bigger part of your concern as a family. And then lots and lots of online resources nowadays. I like things like Khan Academy. It's not just math. Math is a big part, but there's others as well, and it's free. And you can do some self-paced learning and take pre-tests and so on and move ahead. Online libraries, other online resources and free resources like Duolingo, learning some more languages. And then Coursera. Coursera isn't the only one. It's coursera.org, but I've loved it for years. Essentially, it is free college level coursework in any class or area you could think of, and it's 13 or older with parent permission, and you can really dive deep. And there's ways you can pay for it for continuing ed and so on, but a ton of them, hundreds, maybe thousands, are totally free. And they can connect online or in person with others in the area that are also taking that online course. This has been really helpful. I mentioned that Colleen mentioned that I've been with special education and gifted education for a lot of years now. I worked with individuals as well that had real unique skill sets that weren't doing well in school. There was one young lady that I worked with that had nearly an intellectual disability. Her IQ was very, very low. And so she really, really struggled with academics. But my goodness, her interpersonal skills were outstanding. And she was very kind of cute and outgoing and strong leader and great with little kids and great with her peers. And so she had a real skill set. And so when others started talking about giftedness, Howard Gardner has done some really interesting research, and it's not the type of thing that we would use to identify learners within a school or a school district. But I think that it's very helpful in terms of both learner profiles and also a different conception of giftedness. So going back to that young lady that said, I guess I'm average, I'm not gifted like my sisters. When I started talking with students about his model and the research he did, and it's kind of fascinating, but it's really, he looked at a few different things, but one included individuals with big disabilities or brain injuries, where there could be just one discrete area that was profoundly gifted or talented still. Fascinating work. There's 8 different areas at this point that he's identified, and it might be another avenue when we start looking at what giftedness means in a different light. Thinking about what you can do as a family, you know, whether there's an advanced learning plan or goals that the school is doing, coming up with goals for your child on your own as well. So trying to focus on the strengths, and then even in their areas of need, can it be embedded within that strength? So if my child, which relates to my child, if my child's very verbose and a great speaker and so on, but really struggles with writing, then let's use writing tools and services that we have online, you know, speech to text, things like that, to help. So it's tying his need to his strength. Common assets that a lot of gifted learners have that might work here as well includes that creativity or divergent thinking. So sometimes a teacher wants oftentimes the exact right answer, but gifted children or children that are very bright in other ways really think of things differently, and they might come up with an alternative solution that's just as strong. They might also, you know, just have a different way of doing it. I was talking to a psychologist at work today, and she said that'll happen sometimes where even with the IQ tests, there's a right answer, but the gifted kids or kids that are extremely advanced as well will come up with vocabulary or ways to describe it, which are kind of beyond what is expected for the answer. A lot of curiosity. Whoops, we touched on that already. I'm going to go back to our list again. Curiosity, leadership, lots of questioning. So they might push back. They might not be the most popular student in school because they might question leaders or teachers or administration as well. Building that leadership, that could be in or out of school. Strong vocabulary, strong passions, and unique interests. A lot of empathy and ability to relate to others. Now, that doesn't mean that they respond in a super warm or appropriate way all the time, but they're deeply caring often. And how can we foster that and give them some outlets to keep building that? What we would like is more teaming, more true partnerships, right? That can be hard with the amount of time that both families, parents, teachers have. But as much as possible, can we really come together? We know you have great insights that we'll never have. And of course, sometimes teachers and educators have some really important things to say that might not be seen or you might not be aware of at home. So I think getting some true input, and hopefully you feel that or can find your advocates, find your allies, and get more, be able to give more input and be more of a true partner. Allow time for various spokespeople. So it's always interesting. It might not just be the general classroom teacher, but maybe the art teacher, the PE teacher, right? They're seeing things in each of those contexts very differently often. And then trying to collaborate on solutions. As we're wrapping up, I wanted to talk about a few successes that that I've been privileged to be a part of. You know, finding, again, a school where maybe that label never transpires, but finding a school that's a really good fit, you know, that art student that ends up in an arts-based school, or that loves science and they end up at a terrific STEM school, or just a school that has a lot of high achievement where average is 1, 2, 3 years ahead, and they may or may not have that gifted label. Found other challenges through school, maybe focused on language. That's not always going to do it for our learners, but it is another layer of complexity and skill that a lot of learners appreciate. You can often look at ways to access your community college by 13, 14 years old. It's things that you can research with your district, research with the local community colleges as well. And by the time they're in high school, there are some great concurrent enrollment options. there are ways to build up a portfolio. So if your learner maybe isn't showing it on the standardized tests, but they have amazing artwork or poetry or leadership successes, there's ways to build that to look at identification also. I mentioned it varies very much so from district to district. So that's another piece to navigate. And then just successes where families have been able to successfully advocate for more supports. So I think thinking about what are my child's strengths, what are their needs, what's their learning profile, and can we work together to get those supports in place? I wanted to share one more thing, and it looks like it cut off. There are some great resources, and I will go ahead and share that later. But one is from that myth of average that I mentioned. Another is the Colorado Department of Education. And if you type in their search bar, gifted and talented or twice exceptional, you're going to get to a lot of resources, including looking at the law, looking at guidelines for how to identify learners. I've got access to some other things in terms of some of the assessments you could be looking at. And then last but not least, I wrote a book with gifted children in mind, but it's really highlighting, we never use the word gifted actually in it. It's highlighting the needs of a lot of these learners that have similar profiles. It's a little 5-minute daily reader, and it's something that could be read before bed or at the beginning of the day or at school. That covers things like perfectionism, handling our feelings, friendships, and the like, lots of other perfectionism and other topics. And that's called Make a Great Day, Daily Thoughts for Children. And that is available on Amazon. And with that, I would love to chat. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Ewing. So we did have one question from Mel Gerner. They asked, before decisions are made, why isn't there earlier discussion with parents? In their experience, it's just us being told and not a part of the conversation.
Yeah. I think some of it is coaching on the best way to collaborate. And I think a lot of it is that overwhelm that teachers feel. And I'm so sorry that you're having that experience. I think looking at additional advocates, asking for more information, being that squeaky wheel, which I mentioned before, but I think we need a lot more collaboration, and we need a lot more time explaining and answering questions and supporting families. And I know that that's not always happening. I would love, beyond myself, Dr. Ulrich certainly works with many families on this as well. Are there things you would add?
I mean, I think you touched on it. We'll never know kids as well as the parents know them. So as soon as we can pull them into any conversation, then the better off we are, because ultimately it is a partnership between home and school, which actually leads me to just a couple other questions that I wanted to hear your perspective on as you were talking. So one thing that I just had me thinking about was like some of those traditionally marginalized populations. So obviously equity, inclusion, diversity is very near and dear to both of our hearts. And just thinking about how many people are coming to this country and or are in the country, but maybe didn't have positive experiences in the educational system themselves, and just don't even maybe understand our educational system. And so much of, it's like I was thinking about it, a lot of those successes that you were talking about were about going outside of their school and or finding those other avenues, things like that. What advice would you have for those people who maybe don't have the knowledge to do that or don't have the ability, whether it's because like you touched on like transportation or money or any of those things?
Well, I think best case scenario, the schools are educating their staff and they're educating the families as well as in terms of resources. I know with larger districts, we're able to do more outreach. We certainly are working more and more in the Denver area on doing that. As far as students that are under-identified, right? We're missing millions each year, and the students that are underidentified are often our Black and Brown learners. It's often our students that are learning the English language still. It's often our students that have disabilities that are twice exceptional, right? And so our assessments aren't very good, right? And kind of we can continue that same pattern of the individuals that wrote the test, right, or that come from that same population are more likely to do well on those tests. And of course, the insiders that have all of the information about the ins and outs of how to get into the best schools and research the best schools and so on, they dominate the schools. So I've seen some schools where they're in an entirely, you know, largely Black population, and yet it's all white, upper class individuals by and large that are at that school, which of course is not at all what we're wanting to see. So I think the more that we can educate families, and for a lot of families, right, some of us really value the term, and again, it hurts if our child's not identified gifted. For others, they don't associate that with their population because no one ever talked to them about being gifted, or they were just told that they were the trouble kid, or you know, when you think of gifted stereotypes, there's a lot of individuals that are never represented in our media or anything else. So I think there's a lot of work to do still, but the more we can, there's a lot of work to do. We've got a lot of teachers that don't know really what gifted is at all yet. And so some of our families might be far more educated.
I think that's an interesting point too. So Mel Gerner wrote back and said, it's hard because we I think as parents, we don't always know what we don't know. And then I lean on the already overwhelmed educators to guide us. And I think that's a solid point, leaning on the overwhelmed educators. And what you just touched on is that gifted and advanced education studies are not a part of most teacher prep programs, not a part of administration programs. And so it's not just that educators are overwhelmed, but there's just that lack of knowledge that has to be there because they are such a unique group of learners. And so I think that that's another question too, is any advice on how to work with school systems that have a more deficit approach to just learners in general, right? Whereas gifted is very strength-based. What would your advice be to the parent who is struggling with their school system because they do have that deficit approach?
Part of it, I think, is getting as involved as you can. Some people can, some people can't, but joining, for instance, CAGT, right? If you're not a part of that already, joining the family kind of subsection of that, going to these things, educating yourself. There's lots of free trainings through the Colorado Department of Ed and modules and things that you can look at there. Within the schools, I think that the buzzword is to say we're asset-based, right? But it doesn't take a lot to walk in and go, oh, I think all the focus is on those learners that are struggling, or, you know, there's 2 or 3 students in the class that need extra support, and then my child's kind of sitting and not getting what they need. I've seen families, you know, ask how they can collaborate and bring in some additional work or start collaborating with the teacher to find that work that's actually at their child's level. I think sometimes in some way kind of calling out when, hey, is this really an asset-based approach, right? But calling out has kind of a negative connotation. How can we collaborate, right? And for everyone to just, I think even just calling it out, like, hey, I want to be a part of this team. I want to be a part of this discussion. And that way, because I can tell you on the educator side as well, teachers are a little, right? They might be really comfortable talking to 5th graders. That doesn't mean they're comfortable talking to parents. So sometimes they're anxious. We might think as parents, oh gosh, you know, I'm so nervous talking to this teacher, or I don't want to overstep. I promise most of the time on their end, they're a little bit nervous as well. So just kind of regrounding ourselves in the fact that we're all doing it because we love our learners, right?
Yes, that common ground, absolutely.
Right.
Well, just wanted to wrap it up with one final question. This is an interesting topic and one that really probably isn't brought to light enough. So what initially made you interested in it?
I think that it's an experience that many have every year, right? Again and again, I've talked to teachers that might not know what to do. I've certainly talked to parents and kids that have been upset. And so I wanted to really just start that conversation on, what happens when I think my child's gifted and so far it's looking like maybe they're not, or maybe they're at the 92nd percentile, but state law now is saying the 95th percentile, that type of thing where they've got these needs, but they might not have the label. And just kind of breaking down what those experiences are, both on the educator side and on the family side a bit, so that we can begin the conversation and problem solve for what we're going to do moving ahead.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for everyone who joined us this evening. Thank you, Dr. Ewing, for joining us and sharing your knowledge with us. We hope that everybody has a wonderful evening. And we know that many districts across Colorado are on fall break. So if you are on fall break, we hope that you are having a wonderful one. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.